All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We're going to unpack how a seemingly innocent, wobbly dessert actually became a mirror reflecting 20th century American society. Because, food is rarely just about sustenance, right? It tells a story. It tells us who we are, how we live, and what we value. And honestly, very few foods can tell us more about life in 20th century America than the absolute wobbling jewel of domestic achievement itself, the Jell-O salad. So today, we're exploring the fascinating and honestly sometimes baffling social history of this totally iconic food. I mean, just look at the sheer absurdity of this dish by today's standards. You've got vegetables and literal chunks of meat congealed together in this giant block of aspic. This right here is a jellied veal loaf. It's a recipe pulled straight from the mid-century glory days of gelatin cookery. Get this, it even called for a couple teaspoons of MSG. Now, to our modern eyes, this might look like something straight out of a gallery of regrettable food. But for decades, dishes exactly like this were the absolute pinnacle of domestic entertaining. Which brings us to our central mystery today. Why on earth did 20th century Americans put tuna, cabbage, and hot dogs inside of gelatin? Like, how did we go from this being an elite status symbol to suddenly encasing our Tuesday night leftovers in neon green gelatin? What possessed entire generations of cooks to mold tuna salad into the shape of a literal fish, complete with little sliced olive eyes? Or suspend shredded cabbage and hot dogs in these perfectly clear, jiggling towers? Well, the answer is a wild ride through the industrialization of our food system, shifting expectations about women's labor, and some absolutely genius marketing. So, part 1, from calves' feet to convenience. Let's start by looking backward to the pre-industrial era, where jelly was actually anything but a cheap convenience food. In fact, going back to medieval Europe, all the way through the American colonies, gelatin was exclusively the domain of the ultra-rich. And this quote right here brilliantly illustrates the grueling, and frankly, pretty gross, multi-day process of rendering collagen. This is from Hannah Glass's 1747 cookbook, and it details literally boiling calves' feet in 10 quarts of water, clarifying it with egg whites, and then straining it over and over through flannel bags. It was a labor so unbelievably intense that only the elite, think Thomas Jefferson serving wine jelly to his guests at Monticello, could actually afford the kitchen staff required to put it on the table. When you served gelatin back then, you were quite literally showing off the size and the skill of your household staff. So the crucial takeaway here is that this extreme aristocratic luxury became democratized in the absolute blink of an eye. In 1897, a carpenter and cough syrup maker named Pearle Wait figured out how to add fruit flavors to granulated gelatin. He created an instant mix that his wife named JellO, but he didn't really have the marketing capital, so he sold the patent 2 years later to a guy named Orator Woodward for a mere $450. $450? That's roughly $11,000 today. And that tiny, tiny investment would soon change the American dinner table forever. Moving on to Section 2, Marketing an American Icon. Let's look at how Woodward's Genesee Pure Food Company actually managed to get this strange new powder into every single American cupboard. Because believe it or not, at first it didn't sell very well at all. But looking at the brand's rapid timeline, you can see how pioneering marketing tactics transformed a really slow-selling item into an absolute massive hit. The true stroke of genius happened in 1904. The company sent literal armies of salesmen door to door, just handing out free Jell-O cookbooks. They taught housewives exactly how to use it. Then, fast forward to 1914, an automatic packaging machine gets invented that can pack the powder into seamless wax paper. Boom! Suddenly, their factory in Leroy, New York is running 3 shifts, employing over 300 women, and mass-producing this once unobtainable luxury for the entire country. And the timing was just perfect. Jell-O tapped right into that turn-of-the-century home economics craze, which was also known as the domestic science movement. Homemakers were really looking to embrace the industrial age with efficiency, purity, and above all, cleanliness. Jell-O was fast, it was super economical, and most importantly, it was completely mess-free. Unlike a tossed salad that might flop over the edge of a plate and look messy, a jellied salad was described by food historian Laura Shapiro as a salad at last in control of itself. All right, Section 3, the post-war savory salad boom. Now we're getting to the mid-century peak, which is where things get wonderfully weird, with the introduction of savory lime, celery, and mixed vegetable flavors. After World War II, food corporations had really perfected industrial processing, and they were super eager to sell these convenient instant products to the booming middle class. But the post-war housewife faced a massive dilemma here. On one hand, advertisers are pushing convenience, telling women they don't have to be chained to the stove anymore. But on the other hand, societal expectations were incredibly strict. A famous 1950 study actually showed that women who used instant coffee were judged by their peers as lazy or bad wives. Feeding a family was supposed to be a woman's duty, right? An act of love that required real effort. So, women resolved this paradox in a completely fascinating way. They started adding intense labor back into instant foods through these incredibly elaborate, highly decorative presentations. Just look at how these branded cookbooks and magazine ads pushed women to essentially doctor up their meals. Serving a plain can of tomato soup or some leftover hot dogs, that felt way too lazy to serve on its own. But if you suspended them in a magnificent tiered green gelatin mold, beautifully decorated with, say, radish roses and mayonnaise frosting, well then you were practicing gracious living. Food companies totally capitalized on this. They started publishing recipes that shoehorned their products into literally every single part of the meal, resulting in those crazy molded centerpieces we instantly associate with the 1950s. It is honestly fascinating to see how this marketing built up across the decades, because JellO adapted perfectly to every single era. During the Great Depression, ads were reminding housewives that they could stretch tiny amounts of leftovers to feed a whole family with just a 10-cent box of gelatin. Then during World War II rationing, recipes for things like olive relish encased in lime Jell-O allowed hosts to prove they could still do luscious entertaining despite the shortages. And by the time we hit the 1950s and 60s, it had become the ultimate medium for domestic art. It gave ordinary women a way to aspire to a higher social status right there at their dinner table. Which brings us to Section 4, shifting culture and declining sales. Because, of course, societal tastes are always shifting, and eventually the wobbly empire began to crack. By the mid-1970s, the savory celery and Italian salad flavors were being quietly pulled from supermarket shelves. The savory gelatin salad was effectively killed off by a massive cultural shift. The women's movement of the 1970s and 80s saw women entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Working mothers simply no longer had the time, or let's be real, the desire, to spend hours layering vegetables into a gelatin mold and then waiting 4 hours for it to set. They needed truly fast, microwave-friendly options. At the exact same time, a rising diet culture started aggressively rejecting the hidden sugars found in gelatin in favor of fresh tossed greens and sun-dried tomatoes. And just like that, the era of the savory Jell-O mold was over. But the story doesn't end there. Section 5, the modern Jell-O legacy. Okay, so the savory Jell-O salad might be safely congealed in the mold of history, but the brand itself is far from dead. The company quickly pivoted back to marketing it primarily as a snack and dessert, introducing huge hits like pudding pops and jigglers. And today, Kraft Heinz still sells over 1 billion packages of Jell-O annually. 1 billion. That is some incredible staying power for a pantry staple, even if we aren't exactly stuffing cabbage and tuna inside of it quite as often as we used to. And hey, we really can't talk about modern Jell-O without talking about the Jell-O belt. In places like Utah, which actually boasts the highest per capita consumption of the dessert in the entire world, the savory and decorative Jell-O salad remains a deeply beloved staple. You will easily find 4 or 5 different kinds of Jell-O salads at church basement potlucks and community events out there. It is so ingrained in the regional culture that back in 2001, Utah officially designated Jell-O as the state snack? How fun is that? But even beyond the Midwest and the Mormon corridor, gelatin continues to evolve in some pretty brilliant ways. You've got the infamous Jell-O shot, which was actually popularized way back in the 1950s by the musician Tom Lehrer. On top of that, we see jellied textures totally flourishing in Asian cuisine today, from savory aspics in soup dumplings to chewy boba teas. And even at the absolute highest end of fine dining, molecular gastronomy chefs like Grant Achatz are using gelatin for these mind-bending savory experiments, like creating literal soy gels. The medium itself has evolved so far beyond that 1950s dinner table. Looking back at all of this, it is just wild to think that gelatin went from this grueling aristocratic status symbol to a mid-century savory centerpiece and finally to a quirky modern dessert. We might laugh at the cabbage suspended in lime green towers now, but it really makes you wonder, what ultra-popular convenience food of today will be congealed in the decorative mold of history tomorrow? Which of our very own trendy pantry staples or viral social media recipes will be looked back on with this exact same fascinating, quirky nostalgia in 100 years? Just something to think about the next time you're whipping up dinner. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.